Hello everyone, welcome back. We are once again doing a wrap-up of the past 3 months because I'm terrible at this, but one of the books that took half of my September was the start of a new fantasy series. This is Ordinary Monsters by J.M. Miro. This was perfect for the start of autumn. It is classic in a lot of ways. It's a story about a group of young outcasts who come together, who are kind of rounded up in a series of odd ways and brought to this institute called Cardendale Institute because all of these young people have abilities. They have, it might be seen as an illness or a disorder, but they have these abilities that fall into 5 categories or families. Examples are, one of our characters is a Halen. He has the ability to regenerate, heal himself, recuperate. There's also people who have the ability to control the air and dust around them, called dust workers. But we start out being introduced to a group of odd characters, and there is some violence in this book, and that's what I was kind of confused about because in a lot of ways it's a classic YA fantasy novel. All of the classic elements are there. It sometimes feels very YA, but then there is pretty sick violence in this book, so some of it I was just confused who the target audience is. But we're introduced to this young boy when he's a baby called Marlowe, and he is a talent but seems to fall outside of the 5 families that exist that we know of. And he transcends the overall stories in a lot of ways because a lot of this book is taken up by a whole bunch of different perspectives. Probably too many perspectives. It could have been streamlined a little bit, and some of the perspectives were just not as interesting or as necessary as others. But a lot of this book is taken up with these different people who work for this mysterious, odd, brilliant gentleman who runs Cardendale Institute, who work for this man who travel all over the world, all the different continents, to find these children who are marked as talents and kidnap them, corral them, coerce them to come to Cardendale Institute to learn how to control their abilities, but also probably be used for some malintent. I didn't love it, but I enjoyed it. It really was, like, this type of fantasy novel is a warm hug of a book. I will read the rest of the series. I don't know when they come out because I think this came out fairly recently, but it is such an autumnal, fall, even wintry read. But there is like odd episodes of violence, but there are like interesting beings. It feels Victorian in a lot of ways. It's like a YA Jonathan Strange or Mr. Norrell in some ways. So it was fun, it was haunting, interesting, and it ended in a really interesting way. So I am intrigued about where the story goes with this young Marlowe character because we learn a little bit more about him and why he might seem different even in this band of outcasts and why he might be the key, you know. But a fun one. Nothing mind-blowing, but enjoyable. Then I read this book, My Policeman by Bethan Roberts. I read it for a book club because we have like different monthly themes, and this month's theme was books that are either have been or will be adapted into a film or television series. So this was adapted into a movie. I don't actually know if it came out yet, but it's with Harry Styles, so all the rage. This is about, set in 1950s Brighton, a young woman, Marion, falls in love with and is kind of in awe of this young man, Tom, who is her good friend's older brother. And she's like captivated by him since she's a young child. We see her kind of awkward adolescence. She becomes a teacher, he becomes a policeman, and through a series of ways that might kind of have been forced on her end, they wind up being in a lot of the same spaces. He ends up giving her swimming lessons in the sea, and she falls for him and he proposes to her. And he ends up meeting a man named Patrick who works for the local museum, who asks Tom to participate in this artistic endeavor that he's working on for portraits of local people in their community. And Tom and Patrick end up having a relationship, so it becomes this love triangle where there's not a whole lot of love going on. So it could have been interesting. The problem is that Marion and Patrick both had the potential to be really interesting characters. Patrick had a lot going for him in terms of his character and his intrigue and the way he saw the world. Marion had a lot of potential as an interesting character, but Tom, who they're both supposed to be enamored by, in love with, crossing a lot of different societal lines to get this man, he was so boring, dull, gray, vanilla, nothing interesting about him. He had pretty horrible opinions. He wasn't described in any interesting way other than being like very traditionally handsome. So I literally do not understand why both of these people, Marion and Patrick, went through all that they did. I literally did not understand it. And also nothing happened in this book. It just felt like a lost opportunity. So not for me. Then I read a book that I enjoyed. That was not what I expected, but I still enjoyed it. I read the book of Form and Emptiness by Ruth Ozeki. This is my first ever Ozeki. I did kind of a reading vlog where I talked about this book. Or actually, it might have been a full reading vlog. I think it was. But this is a really interesting book that I would recommend, but it's not what I thought it was when I picked it up. I thought it was really going to be a magical realism book, a coming of age, really whimsical and odd, and it did have all of those elements that I just said, but it was really much deeper than that. We are introduced to this young boy, Benny, who sees his father, Kenji, die in a horrific accident right outside of their house. He is run over by a truck, and Benny sees it, and from that moment, from that grief that him and his mother, Annabelle, is that her name? They both experience this shared grief, and it's what happens to their mental state and their wellness after seeing the death of their husband slash father. So Benny starts to hear the voices of objects. So anything around him, from a rubber duck to a couch to a shirt. I'm just making these things up, but he can hear the voices of objects. And his mother, Annabelle, starts to have a really severe hoarding problem where she's not able to throw anything else out. Her house becomes extremely claustrophobic, which is hard in any situation, but for a son who can now hear the voices of things when your house is filling up with things, that's even more challenging. At the root of this novel, it's about the relationship between mother and son. It becomes really tumultuous and strained, but there's so much love there. It's about how you deal with grief, how it evolves in different ages, because Benny goes from like a young child into his adolescence and what that means. It's also about, I believe, I'm not actually sure, but I think it's set near the election of Trump, because Benny is Asian American. His father, Kenji, was an immigrant to the US. And his mother, Annabelle, is white. I think her name's Annabelle. I might totally be making that up. And it's about him, whether knowingly or not, the insecurity he feels in his safety in the US at this time and at this point in time. It was rather beautiful. And then a whole other portion of this book. So we hear from Benny, from his mother, and then from the book, which is crucial, and I feel like I've totally forgot to mention that up until this point, but Benny hears the voices of all objects, and he finds solace and a moment of quiet and relief in the public library, where he meets kind of a ragtag group of people, but he also finds this book that is his book. It's narrating his life and his mother's life because of how entwined they are. And the chapters that are about this book are so wise and beautiful and moving and kind of hit you with like a quick punch of like smart, witty thought. And I really, really liked this. It wasn't straight up magic, but it was actually a lot more than that. So this book surprised me, and I really enjoyed my reading experience. So I would definitely recommend this, and I am looking forward to reading more Ozeki because I think she has such an interesting take on words and narrative voices, and she has a lot of wisdom to impart. So I really liked this. Then we enter into October, where I read a couple of really good books, 2 specifically. I read my first ever Ursala K. Le Guin that I actually finished because I started The Dispossessed, wasn't massively engaged with it. I will certainly try it again. It's still at home at my parents' house, so I can definitely pick it up. But I was in like a fantasy mood. You know, autumn, that's what you want to read, historical fiction and fantasy, at least for me. That's what calls to me at this time of the year. But I read A Wizard of Earthsea, which is the beginning of, so it's called The World of Earthsea. So I'm not sure if it's like a series, how many books there are. But this is the first one. And another book that kind of surprised me. I've heard that Ursula Le Guin is like she talks about kind of these big ideas that have like a lot of fantastical elements and sci-fi elements, but that her books at their core remain really quiet and thoughtful, and she's kind of giving her musings on the world. I don't know if that's how you say it. But we are introduced to a young boy named Jed or Ged, who eventually he has like this alter ego. He was once called Sparrowhawk, so in his youth, but then he becomes, what does he become? Oh, right, that's the whole point of the book. I can't tell you what he becomes. But this book is about a young man's coming of age. It is deeply magical, and while it might have elements that seem out there, like a battle with a dragon to the death, and this magical university where he's taught, and different mentors, and kind of his great travel along kind of huge plains to get to different magical institutions, it is so quiet and thoughtful and almost tender. For me, I'm a sucker for any book that has either right at the beginning has a map with all of the details of the world we're about to be introduced to, or a cast list, which talks about, like, for example, in Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, at the beginning of each book in the series, there's a whole cast of characters, who they are, how they're connected, what family they belong to, what era they lived, or what decade they lived in, the whole thing. So you can really get the scope of the novel. And this, I mean, I love this. So for me, one of the best parts of this book was walking with Jed or Ged to all of the different places he encountered, how the different people in different towns or villages viewed magic, and how magic was either integral to their lives and their community and their sense of being, or how it might kind of be outsider. But in this world, magic is a part of life, but really this magic is more about nature and homeostasis and balance, because Jed is finding his sorcery and his magic through adolescent strife, but also through his connection with the world and his journeys and finding himself. I don't know if Ursula Le Guin, her style, touches me as much as it touches other people, but I enjoyed it, and I will certainly read more in the Earthsea series. I finally read the second book in, what's the trilogy called? The Wormwood trilogy by Tade Thompson, Insurrection. So the first book in the series is Rosewater. I read it all the way back last November, so a year ago. And did I love this? Oh my god. So this is a continuation of the same world, and if you haven't heard of the series, I'll give you kind of an overview about what happened in Rosewater. So Rosewater is a community, you could call it a city, that rose up around this alien biodome called Wormwood that came down, kind of planted itself in this Nigerian community, and infrastructure exploded around this alien biodome because I believe it's once a year the biodome, the actual dome, opens up and has this healing power to all beings around it. So people travel from all over the world. There's mass pilgrimage to this area for people to go for healing, whether it be like your mental health, cancer, anything. So obviously this is profitable. So this huge infrastructure explodes around this alien biodome. And in this, at the end of the last novel, to not spoil anything, we're seeing how, yes, this alien presence has this benefit to the human race, but that there's also a sense of infiltration and intoxication and, you know, I won't say anything else. But this book is a little bit more bureaucratic in nature. So we are kind of taken out of the chaos a little bit, and we go into one of the really powerful leaders who's able to rally up a community. Jax. I loved this book so much because I thought it was, first of all, brilliant. I've never really read a sci-fi like this. I think it is so smart at its core. But more than that, it is about how Rosewater now has feet to stand on to declare independence from Nigeria because of the wealth and the infrastructure and the power of, perhaps it's seen as partnering with Wormwood, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. But then it's also like the narrative voices that pop up in this book are like intoxicating, so interesting. We're seeing, I don't want to spoil anything, but I think this book is like one of the most brilliant sci-fi trilogies out there. I highly recommend. And then a book that I don't want to spend too much time talking about because I assume even if you haven't read it, you know what it's about. But I finally finished Dune. I started this so very long ago, and I started out physically reading it. And I don't know if it was the mood I was in at the time, but I just couldn't connect. The writing, specifically the writing of dialogue, is very stilted and very rigid. So I ended up listening to this on audiobook. I think this book is a classic for a reason. The world building in this is like nothing I've ever read. So just like a very limited plot of what this book is about. It is about different ruling families fighting for control of the desert planet called Dune. The Harkonnens have had control of Dune for a very, very long time under the permission of the Emperor, who kind of oversees all of these different planets. It is like epic sci-fi. It's so cool. And for some reason, they decide to switch things up and demand that the Harkonnens retreat from Dune and House Atreides is brought in. It is not a gift to House Atreides because the Harkonnens are out for blood because of the vast amount of wealth that Dune, the production of spice, which is what Dune has. But a whole nother layer to this book is that the removal of the Harkonnens, bringing in the Atreides, it is just like cycles of colonization to the indigenous people of Dune. For me, the listening experience was much better than physically reading it because so much of this book is internal dialogue. And I'm not going to lie, it's like probably, it's a little bit pretentious. There's a lot of like prescient memory and thought, and it's like it just is pretentious, but I don't really mind that. But I think what's key to this book that you have to kind of remind yourself while you're reading it, because who the book is kind of putting on a pedestal as hero is one of the main colonizer's son, but it's this entire ruling family, and how he's able to become this kind of messiah figure, and that's like deeply problematic because he's a colonizer himself. This is like the first of a series. I probably won't read the rest of the series. That's not because I didn't like this. I just feel like I'm good. Like I got what I wanted to get out of it. I don't need more of this world. I feel like there's a whole lot of world in this book alone, so I'm good. Then another highlight of the last few months that I just loved this book so deeply, and I selfishly feel like this book was made for me. It's The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. So why I say this was made for me, first of all, I discovered that I love Maggie O'Farrell by reading Hamnet last year. But this book is set in the 1550s Florence. Lucrezia de Medici. It is her adolescence, her story, because she died. Everyone believes that she was poisoned by her husband, the Duke of Ferrara. Is that correct? Yes. Yeah. Ferrara. So This is something that I feel like is Maggie O'Farrell's thing. She picks a character, for example, Shakespeare's son, Hamnet. We know that we are introduced to the reality of their death at the beginning of the novel, and as a reader, you mentally prepare yourself. But then the way that she writes these young people, you fall in love with them. You're engulfed in their story, in their adolescence. Specifically here, Lucrezia's girlhood is, there's so much insecurity and lack of tenderness and curiosity, and you like fall for Lucrezia instantly. And you really feel kind of the autumn air of the palazzo in Florence as she's running along with her sisters and brothers going to their their school. But the crux of this novel is that Lucrezia is married off, a political marriage. Her father, Cosimo de' Medici, marries her off to the Duke of Ferrara, who is known to be cruel, cunning, brutal, and she has all of these expectations of what her life will be, and kind of this cruelty of separating her not only from where she grew up, but the woman who helped raise her and her sisters, and she's married off at 16. And the beginning of this book, I just want to read it to you because it was so, like, your breath catches. Lucrezia is taking her seat at the long dining table, which is polished to a watery gleam and spread with dishes, inverted cups, a woven circlet of fur. Her husband is sitting down, not in his customary place at the opposite end, but next to her, close enough that she could rest her head on his shoulder should she wish. He is unfolding his napkin and straightening a knife and moving the candle towards them both, when it comes to her with a peculiar clarity, as if some colored glass has been put in front of her eyes, or perhaps removed from them, that he intends to kill her. She is 16 years old, not quite a year into her marriage. I mean, the book just gets better and better and better. It is devastating, heart-wrenching, beautiful. There are moments of tenderness, and at the very beginning, that's what I kind of remember most fondly about Hamnet, is that it was heartbreaking and devastating, but that there was such love and intense family connection, especially Hamnet's mother, that you couldn't help but be brought into their story and into their lives. And for me, this setting of 1550s Florence is like all I could ever dream about reading. But Lucrezia herself is a character you love, you feel for, you want to protect her, and you feel scared with her, and you think of her in her girlhood and what that must have been like. Quite the plot twist at the end. I was not expecting that. This was like a historical fiction in all its glory, so highly recommend. Okay, we are nearing the end. In November, I only read 2 books because one was really chunky, but also just took all of my brain capacity because I fell into the world and I absolutely loved it. But before we jump into that, I read Moon of the Crusted Snow. I'm not sure how to pronounce the author's first name, but their last name is Rice. This is a book about an apocalyptic event, or what that really means. This is set in an Anishinaabe community. I'm not sure if it's in Canada or the US, but this is about a small indigenous community who still lives kind of separate from the colonizer society. It's set in modern times, and they go dark. And what that means is that first they lose electricity, then they lose power, then they lose gas, heat. And this is like the most gripping realism that's just straight up like a good novel, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. To me, it's like The Beach by Alex Garland or Station 11 by Emily Mandel. But just like such gripping realism. You feel like you're there. You feel the cold in your bones. Key part of this novel is that while this indigenous community is caring for each other, a lot of them have maintained kind of their hunting and have stockpiled up enough food because this is how they're used to living. They only introduced electricity and these different things into their community more recently. So the loss in them doesn't feel as instantly terrifying, but obviously the tension builds as winter is approaching, and a white man shows up in their community, and it's very clear that like well, they've been cut off from communication with the kind of the rest of the world. They know that if it's happening here, it's happening there. And this white man shows up and he is instantly terrifying, not trustworthy. And the community elder says to our main characters, what does it mean to have a modern day apocalypse when your people have had their apocalypse before and ongoing, when your culture's been tried to be stolen from you, when there's been forced assimilation, that like she's already survived their apocalypse. So what does this mean, and how can their community, who still has the skills and the knowledge and the connection with the world and the earth, how are they able to continue, and what does that look like? So I thought this was incredible. Perfect to read this time of year because it is bone chilling. Now we get to a book that I only finished a couple days ago. I was blown away by it. I'm not even sure how to put into words. Like, this will become a huge part of my personality, if we're being honest. But this is Perdido Street Station by China Mieville. I ate this up. I'm not even sure where to start. I took so many notes, but now looking at them, I'm like, what was I talking about? I was just rattling off ridiculous things. But this is set in the city of New Crobasan. Perdido Street Station is one of the core train stops that connects all of the different pockets of New Crobasan. This city is brought to life in such an uncomfortable, seedy, sometimes grotesque, palpable way. It is inhabited by a bunch of different races. There's alien races, human races, cacti, water creatures, bugs. It is teeming with life. And one of the best parts of this book is how much time that Mieville spends on exploring each different community, the way they interact, the way they look, how their specific, their community in New Crobasan, what that looks like, the feeling of being there. And one of the interesting parts of New Crobasan, it is brutal in nature, the culture, how cantankerous New Crobasan feels is really shown in the presence of beings called the Remade, which can be any race, can be cactus or human, who out of punishment are remade based on what the court of law decides befits their crime. So some might have limbs added on to them. They might have metal and machinery connected to their body. This book had like a steampunk thing going on that, to me, I've never read anything like it before, and now I'm like, this is my jam. Like, this is where I belong. This is the type of book like that just sums up mostly everything I could ever be interested in. Obviously, like, my two things are like a Hamnet and this. Like, that's the two sides of my like reading interest. But the crux of this novel is that we're introduced to a man, Isaac, who is a human. He's kind of got that mad scientist thing going on. And he is approached by a being who has had something integral to their sense of self taken from them because they committed this crime. And Isaac doesn't poke too many holes in their story, but agrees to help them because he's interested in solving this mystery and solving this problem. And in the endeavor for knowledge, he sets something free upon New Crobasan that is vicious, horrifying, murderous, and it's kind of like a ragtag group of people who have to go out and destroy this being that is now infiltrating the minds of everyone living in New Crobasan, and it is intense. It is a really linear narrative, which if it wasn't, I feel like I would have been lost in the sauce a little bit more because there's so much chaos. But because it's a really linear story, and you're introduced to different characters and groups of beings at like just the right time, it's like pretty easy to follow, even though it feels like hellfire is raining down upon you. For me, when I read books like this that are doing something that feels so brand new, so out there, so brilliant and odd and strange, there's always the fear that it falls into the gimmicky, and that's what Mieville avoided so perfectly by being so thoughtful and smart and really taking his time building this world to make all of these beings real in your mind. Nothing felt like a gimmick. Nothing felt ridiculous. It felt like you're introduced to something that feels otherworldly and unbelievable, and he convinces you that it's real. Yeah, at the heart of this book is about sentience and alien presence and what that means for feeling beings, because that plays a huge part in the hellfire that's raining down on New Crobazon. But I just thought this was written with such brilliance and like kind of really caring for detail and building a world where your reader feels immersed, but nothing feels off. It feels like he took such care and time to make this world so palpable and real while saying so many brilliant things about what it means to be a feeling, caring being, the difference between the organic and the man-made, and where those lines cross. That's all I have for you today. But let me know what other China Mieville books I should pick up, and kind of your best read of the last couple months, but more importantly, what you want to finish the year out with, because I do have a couple of books that I'm looking at on my shelves, but if I'm being honest, none of the books that I have right now on my shelves I'm not drawn to any of them right now, and I have purchased them all, picked them up from somewhere for a reason, but right now I'm wanting something. I'm wanting more Mieville, if I'm being honest. Like, that's what I'm feeling. Like, I want something weird, gritty, immersive. I need some inspiration, I think, because I am struggling with what to pick up next. But thank you all for watching, and I will see you very soon. Bye, everyone.